He promised to sign an immigration reform bill. He urged votes on gun violence and on raising the minimum wage. And he threatened to use executive orders if Congress fails to act on climate change. Tonight on Basic Black, President Obama's State of the Union address. Will communities of color benefit from these pledges?
Our panel tonight: Philip Martin, senior reporter, 89.7 WGBH Radio; Callie Crossley, host and moderator, Boston Public Radio, WGBH; Peniel Joseph, professor of history, Tufts University, and W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow, Harvard University; Reverend Talbert Swan, president of the Springfield, Massachusetts branch of the NAACP; and Kim McLaren, assistant professor of writing, literature, and publishing, Emerson College. To join the conversation, please visit our website at basicblack.org.
So the President's State of the Union address was this week, and I want to set the context for it in this way. 77% of the persons who watched the State of the Union address came away with a positive response. Most importantly, 71% thought that this indicated that the country was going in the right direction. That's pretty high praise from viewers and folks who heard what the messages were in the speech. We've had some discussions leading up to this speech that the inaugural speech was really part one, and this was part two of a two-part speech. So let's just tick off some of the issues that he raised. I want to start with you, Reverend Swan. Gun violence. And in this time, he spoke about gun violence in an urban setting. What did you think?
Well, I think he needed to speak about it in an urban setting. Far too often, when the president gets involved, it's usually on the heels of a very public incident like Newtown, Connecticut, or Aurora, Colorado, or something like that. But when we look at the fact that in communities of color, 7,000 African Americans die every year because of gun violence. And when you look at the fact that right there in his own backyard in Chicago, some have described it as a war zone. It was something I thought he needed to speak to. He needed to speak very forcibly to. And I think, just like Harry Belafonte said, that there has been missing voices from our communities in that particular discussion. One of the profound things he said is that the streets are being washed with the blood that flows from the bodies of our young people. And I think that that's true. And so the president really did need to speak to that issue.
So having spoken to it, because Peniel, you've been very critical of the president leading up to, about not speaking specifically to urban violence and more specifically to black folk and some of the issues that are ravaging those communities. Did the way that he spoke about urban violence with Hadia's parents there, the young woman who was just killed a few weeks after participating in a parade at the inauguration, did that do it? Have the kind of resonance you wanted it to have?
Well, yeah, I think he did a much better job than the inauguration speech, because I was critical in the sense that he had talked about immigration, he talked about Latinos, he talked about gays and lesbians, all things that are truly progressive and democratic, but he didn't talk about racial equality, right? And in this speech, he did. I mean, he talked about pockets of poverty. Finally, he wasn't expansive about poverty, but I agree the notion of Hadia Pendleton and her parents and this whole notion of urban violence, very, very important. We know who that affects. The Reverend just said 7,000 a year. Very, very important. So I thought this was a speech where African Americans could feel more inclusive. And even the whole notion of the 102-year-old Dessalines Victor, the Haitian immigrant who had waited several hours online, and everybody gave her a standing ovation except the Speaker of the House, by the way, which is appalling.
It was appalling.
But I think that those two examples really showed, at least in an explicit way, even though the president didn't articulate it in his own rhetoric and say African American, we all got the point in a much better way than the second inaugural. So I give him high marks for this. I think one note of criticism that we should have is this. This president now in back-to-back speeches has come out with a robust advocacy for progressive democracy in a way that he should have during the first 2 years of his presidency. We have now a narrative of why he is president of the United States and the kind of movement he wants for the nation to proceed. He's giving us a raison d'etre. First 2 years, even though we got health care, we got a stimulus, we got all kinds of legislation, he forgot to tell the story. There are 3 exceptional journalists on this panel, and they all know something called the lead. They've taught me about the lead. And the lead is what he's finally giving us the last 2 speeches.
Do you agree, Philip?
I absolutely agree. I was thinking that, too. I was thinking, to the consternation of many Republicans, including John Boehner, as you pointed out, who did not stand at the time when he should have stood, because it was almost a neutral point, except for one problem, a neutral only in the sense, only on the surface. But the fact of the matter, it's been Republican policies and Republican machinations that have kept people from voting in places like Florida, that have created 6-hour lines for a 102-year-old woman and thousands of others. And I think that the president was trying to point this out in a way that was not blasting the Republicans. In fact, he talked about a commission, which was very important, putting together a commission, bipartisan commission, the head of Mitt Romney's campaign and that of his own campaign, that's right, to basically come together, excogitate a notion or a real plan for voting in this country. Now that part of that, I would rather him had said, like almost explicitly, that what happened was a shame. I almost wanted him to say what happened in these voting lines was a shame.
But he did say that.
But he did say that. And by pointing out this 102-year-old woman, that did the job.
Yes.
I thought it was beautiful. And in terms of the way he did it, the way he did it, and indeed he is in fact created a narrative for other, an agenda for other items as well, including gun control. My only
Hold on. I want you to hold that, because I want Kim to get this, because this is, I don't want to lose this voting piece right here.
Yeah.
All right, because now we do the notion of pledges. So you've just praised him for raising Desaline Victor and for talking about the introduction of a voting commission. I have to say the League of Women Voters not so impressed.
That was the point I was going to make. I'll be honest with you. My heart sank a little when he said, I'm going to form a presidential commission. Because, I mean, we've had presidential commissions and committees that in Washington, they often spend a lot of time and energy, come up with a nice big packet of paper, and then nothing ever gets done. And I agree with the League of Women Voters that it was a little disappointing that he did not address specific target elements that we know can affect, increasing on voter early voting, right? I mean, some of these things are up to the states, but I think the federal government has a role in leading or pushing. He can use the power of the department, which he did. We did in beating back some of these restrictive measurements. So I wouldn't praise him. I praise him for addressing the issue of voter suppression. I was a little disappointed that it wasn't more targeted and that his remedies weren't more specific. I hope it doesn't rest simply with this commission. I think the commission has the power to investigate the narrative, and hopefully I think what he's trying to do is create bipartisan support. But let's be honest, the Republicans aren't interested in addressing
and let me follow up then and say a lot of people not happy with Ben Ginsburg being appointed the co-chair of said commission, whatever you think about the commission. I'm going to get you to weigh in on this too, Reverend, because he was the former campaign manager for Mitt Romney. As you've said, many of these legislatures that led to the cutoff of early voting, to the restrictive hours, to some states even trying to charge people for voting, came from overwhelmingly Republican.
And the voter ID laws.
And the voter ID laws came from overwhelmingly Republican legislators. So do you think that undercuts?
I think it does. I think the time for trying to extend an olive branch and be bipartisan on some issues is past. He attempted to do that during his first term. Obviously, the Republicans didn't bite. His second term, this is it. You're setting your legacy. You're going to try to get some things done before you're out of office. And the reality is, we all know that all of the voter suppression efforts that took place across America, 34 states trying to change laws, et cetera, was Republican-controlled and Republican-based. And so to take someone who really was in support of those suppression efforts and then to put him on that panel, I think it does undercut the issue.
His rhetoric was great. It's the policy prescriptions, because in the speech on Tuesday night, he said that when people wait in line that long, it betrays our ideas, our ideals, and it betrays our democracy. That's huge. The commission
let me just say this to you. Isn't that the criticism for President Obama? The rhetoric is great, but the policy
exactly.
Right. But I would actually flip that around. I think the criticism against President Obama has been this: the first 2 years, there was actually the biggest social policy that we've had since Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society and the New Deal. That's what we saw. But there was no great rhetoric to back it up. And like I said, there was no story. So what he did the first 2 years is bury the lead. The lead was, look, the stimulus is to help everybody. White folks, construction workers, people who are enemies, to help everybody to transform this democracy, including people of color. He didn't say that. Healthcare, the spin is, the lead is, we're going to save all the old people in the United States of America with healthcare and save young people who live in Mississippi, who live in Memphis, who live in Brooklyn, New York. He buried that. So now what he's doing is he's saying, look, people wait in line for 6 hours. That's betraying our democracy. He's right. But then he says there's a bipartisan.
I think this is what he was trying to do with. First of all, I absolutely agree. I think this whole notion of a bipartisan commission, well, it's not a solution. But here's what I think he was trying to do. I think he was honoring the fact that this is a state issue. Most of these voting laws are state issues. And he's basically saying, I'm going to appoint a commission. But what he's actually saying, but I think we have to look at what he's saying and what he might actually be saying. What he's actually saying is this is a real problem, and we have to figure out a way of tackling it. Yeah. I can't imagine that he really thinks a bipartisan commission on voting is actually going to get to the crux of the problem, because the crux of the problem was caused by Republican machinations in state by state.
Which are still going on.
Which is still going on. But if you, in fact, talk about, if you, in fact, acknowledge the problem, if you embarrass, if you will, those legislators, the governor of Florida. And believe me, if you look at the Miami Herald this week, following the speech, he is embarrassed by Rick Scott, the governor of Florida. So I think this was more about tactics than it really is about policy. In terms of this specific issue,
I would only just say this, and you've attributed all of this to the states. That's not exactly right. Now, when you start talking about the Voting Rights Act, that's federal.
That's right. That's right. But that only covers a few states.
Yes.
That only covers a few states.
The voting rights, no. With Section 5, let's talk, Reverend. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is up before the Supreme Court now.
That's right.
That has been the section that has been the legal recourse for hearing things locally and everywhere else.
You've got about somewhere around over 20 attorneys generals from various states that have challenged Section 5.
That's right.
Basically said that it restricts us from making laws in our own states, and they want to repeal Section 5. And we know that Section 5 protects us because it basically says that these states that have a history of disenfranchising African American voters cannot make wholesale changes to voting laws without them getting approval.
Right.
And so the problem is they're saying we want to remove the restrictions so that we can disenfranchise folk whenever we feel like it.
Right.
I think what I'm talking about, though, I think what's really, in terms of state control, well, you're talking about those things which might seem tiny, but we know they have a massive impact. Restricting voting hours, for example, those are state decisions.
No, the state made the decision, but just to be clear, because I want everybody to be clear, when the groups that oppose that would be the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund and the Justice Department, they use Section 5 as the legal precedent to review that. So we're talking about federal and state.
No doubt the Justice Department can do a lot, as they did. Eric Holder took the state of Pennsylvania, took Ohio.
But I just want to make sure to let everybody know that it's a federal and a state issue.
That's right.
And the reality is that the states, there's a remedy in there that if they can show that they have been in compliance and have not done anything to disenfranchise voters for a certain period of time, I think it's 10 years, then they can be exempted from Section 5. They don't want to go through that process.
Because that's 10 years of enfranchising.
The last point on this is that historically what's interesting is that the Voting Rights Act and Section 5 is there to prevent this kind of so-called race-neutral disenfranchisement, because that's what happened. Because remember, what Ohio did, what Florida did, they singled out black people, but the language was not racial.
Precisely.
It was saying, look, we're going to stop early voting, and they knew that African-American churches in Cleveland had turned out in whopping numbers in 2008. So without the Voting Rights Act, what we're seeing, and we're about to celebrate the 50th anniversary in 2015, we're doomed in terms of racial minorities and poor people.
And the Supreme Court is going to be ruling on this very soon. So we'll have another conversation about that. I want to just move on to some of the other issues. We touched on gun violence at the beginning, and he called specifically for legislation, saying everybody in that audience, the several guests, Gabby Giffords and also Hydea Pendleton's parents, deserved a vote. How close are we, do you think, now? Because there's a lot of public support for some of these initiatives that we have.
What's interesting about the vote is this. Here's where Obama was masterful. People have said that he doesn't master the politics of realpolitik, and that's what that was about. Because the reason why he was doing this invocation, because we were up in church by the time he said,
that was the most moving part.
Hydea Pendleton, it was a call and response. The reason why he did that is this. Democrats are banking on, if you were to do a vote and Republicans said no, that can be held accountable in 2014. That was about the midterms. Obama and his team know there's a small chance, and this would be going against the historical grain, that Democrats recapture the House in 2014. It's never happened. It's never happened. A second-term president, I don't believe, has never in the midterm of the second term after his 6th year just taken over the House again. But it could, because this Congress is at historic lows in terms of public approval. So the reason why he said, we're not close to a vote. The House, Boehner won't do it. We're not close to a vote. We may get an overall anti-violence bill that includes things like background checks, but they're not going to ban any assault weapons, and I don't know if we're going to get any clip reductions.
What would be the impact if he could carry out his pledge to get this gun legislation through here locally, Reverend? What do you know?
Well, Massachusetts here has some very strict gun laws. We've got, in my hometown, we've got Smith & Wesson headquartered there. And we've got a gun problem in Springfield. I think if he got the legislation passed, though, that would be a miracle. And I guess the man upstairs would really be smiling upon him because, as the professor said, I don't think Congress has the backbone to do it. I don't think that Boehner is going to bring it forth. And sadly, there are a lot of Democrats who are very reticent
that's a point I was going to make.
To move toward any real gun control.
And quite honestly, I thought the invocation was very moving. Obviously, it was a powerful part of the speech. Part of me wondered, though, if it wasn't giving those very Democrats cover to some way. He didn't say we need the legislation. He said everybody deserves a vote. You know, he wasn't.
That's from them. They have to vote.
Yeah, I don't think it was giving cover. I think.
Well, no, I'm not sure about that. I thought it was powerful, but I think again it wasn't all the way there. He wasn't demanding that we pass these very specific measures, magazine, large capacity magazines, banning those, the assault weapon ban, and even the background checks. It was everybody, bring it to a vote. Anything can happen with a vote.
I think this was tactical. I think that the call and response was very powerful. To point to the victims of Newtown, to point to the family of this young girl killed in Chicago, Aurora, the cop who was shot multiple times protecting a man, protecting people at the Sikh temple in Wisconsin. That was very powerful. And the idea was to shine a light, literally, in terms of the audience, like in terms of the people in the audience, the Republicans and Democrats, those Democrats that haven't, in fact, wanted to vote on this issue because it is embarrassing to them. Their constituents. You're getting a massive sentiment in the country.
I want to ask, let me just interrupt you because this is the question I want to ask about this. I raised it because I did want to get your response to, what he said in the speech. But I was interested in the fact that he put executive orders and threatened to use that with climate change. I didn't hear him say it on gun control.
Precisely. Which is the point I'm making.
You can only do so much.
He did a 23-point executive order on gun control where he's talking about mental health background checks. He's people who are psychologically unstable, who are former military veterans, giving them better benefits. So there is a 23-point executive order that he did immediately after Newtown.
Yeah, needs congressional approval for some of the other things he's trying to do.
But I think that's a great point, Callie, because of this. The next 2 years, we're going to see no legislation from this Congress except maybe immigration reform that the Congress and the Senate are going to write, and he says he's going to approve as long as it's not too draconian. I would suspect that there's going to be some pathway towards citizenship there. But that's it. There's no cap and trade. There's not going to be the kind of gun legislation that he wants. There's not going to be the kind of infrastructure investment that he wants. But what the executive office can do is targeted revenues. They've talked about building those 15 centers.
Right.
I don't believe Congress is going to give them the $1 billion to do that, but they could do it through targeted revenues. And he's going to have to do, he may have the most executive orders the next 4 years of any president in history.
What about even the preschool proposal? What about that? I mean, again, very soaring rhetoric. I mean, I think, as far as I know, although I've heard Republicans contend this, but as far as I know, the research on preschool is unequivocal about the power of it.
That would cost massive amounts of money, but
that actually might work, and I'll tell you why that stands a chance of working.
I think that's.
I'm not saying. No, I'm not. I don't think. I don't think it's DOA. No, here's why I don't think it's DOA. He was smart enough to take the state of Georgia, the red state of Georgia, as an example. A proposal that was basically created by a conservative out of the University of Chicago. This was his idea, and I think that's and some Republicans are looking at this proposal seriously. However, I think in general it's intransigence on the part of the Republicans.
Okay, well, let me raise another issue because I don't want to get bogged down in the education pieces. I think that's going to be a world win. Minimum wage.
Exactly.
Yes.
Very, very
minimum wage. Is that a pledge that speaks to communities of color?
That
was an instant response from a lot of folks saying no.
It wasn't bold enough. It wasn't bold enough. One thing, people like on Bob Herbert, the former New York Times columnist, Kathy Cohen, who's a professor at University of Chicago, they were discussing all this. And, people have talked about a $10 minimum wage. People even were talking about $10.10. We need to be bold. The only way, away from what Republicans and right-wingers say, the only way to lift poor people out of poverty is a robust minimum wage. Right. Minimum wage is not anti-business. It's not anti-capitalist. It's the only way many people who don't have education, who don't have the kind of access that the middle and upper middle class do, and all of us here who are educated, need that $10 an hour to lift themselves out of poverty.
Let me just interrupt you and say, so a lot of folk with your, not probably as much education as you have, but some of it, and they're working minimum wage jobs right now.
Well, that's right.
That's a fact. So let's be clear.
We're not too far from it.
So he needed to be even bolder. That's one thing. I was happy that he mentioned the minimum wage. Certainly that is impactful for communities of color. But one thing that we've seen, in the last 3 years, the top 1% have made 121% of the gains.
So the gap is wide.
121%. We have the biggest wealth inequality in America since the 1870s and 1880s, since the Gilded Age.
But the argument has been made, and I want to give this to Reverend over here, because for one thing, I want to remind people that when we go onto the web, we're going to be talking about the 104th anniversary of the NAACP, and you're president of the NAACP in Springfield, so we want to give even the context of the issues that the NAACP has to deal with. Economic inequality is huge. And so we're talking about some people who said, yeah, I take your point that it could be raised, but it's a wash by the time you get through taking out what happens in the economy with how expensive it is to live, so that really it wouldn't do anything for folks who need it.
Well, even at $10 an hour, you're talking about, if you had a family of four, you're talking about $20,800 a year, which may be above the poverty line, but it's not that far above it. And so I do agree that he should have been more robust in terms of that, but because still today, for every dollar a white family makes, you've got an African-American family that's down around 47 cents. And so the disparity in terms of economic power is huge, and our communities are impacted by it. And so I think minimum wage has to go up on the federal level. I know there's some states that have gone ahead and raised the minimum wage, and I think that may be the rallying cry if the Congress does not have the heart to do it.
The Congress doesn't have the heart to do it.
It's for the states to move, especially those that have large populations of African Americans and other minorities, to go ahead and raise that minimum wage.
Right.
I want to remind everybody that we're going to go on the web to be continuing this discussion both about the State of the Union and also the 104th anniversary of the NAACP. Go ahead.
Now, Boehner, the House Speaker Boehner, has already said that this is dead, on arrival.
Well, he's abdicated his role.
He's abdicated his role. Now, the problem, and he's cited studies that are basically specious, saying, like that study after study shows, that the minimum wage kills jobs. Well, that's not true.
It's not true.
That's just not true. If most reputable studies, in fact, show the opposite, that by making the amount of money that workers are making right now, they're basically assigned to poverty interminably. There's no way of getting out of poverty making $7.10 an hour right now. And I tend to agree with you. $10, $11, $12 makes, which some economists have advocated would make much more sense in terms of actually touching poverty issue. But I'm happy, at least, that, and again, I'm not settling for this, but I think it was important that Obama addressed this as one of the key issues, the minimum wage in the State of the Union. The fact that he included this in the State of the Union was very important.
Yeah, because it's been a long time since we've even had this conversation.
That's right.
And so I do think.
To continue the conversation, see past episodes, or discover new stories, please visit our website at basicblack.org.